Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today in the galleries, and I know we're all kind of coping with the new announcement of the restrictions, so it's wonderful that we still have the chance to be here together, and we're doing it as safely as we possibly can, but I hope we can also still have fun. We can't get close to each other, but later I hope we can get close to the artworks, so that kind of adds some excitement, and it's always such a pleasure for me to be back in the Southeast Asia Gallery as well. And today, my talk is mostly going to focus on two of my favorite works in the National Gallery's collection, which are these two beautiful lacquer paintings, both from around the early 1940s, made by very well-known artists, Nguyễn Văn Tỵ here and Nenza Qi over there. And one of the fascinating things about lacquer painting is that even though it can look quite spontaneous and free, it's actually extremely meticulous, demanding, and time-consuming to create. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these specific paintings and the history of modern lacquer painting in Vietnam, but we're also going to learn more about the technique used to produce the works and to kind of prepare the work for the lacquer painting. Okay, so let's begin. First, what is lacquer? And this is quite a confusing question these days, because actually we use lacquer for any kind of, the term is quite widely used for any kind of varnish, and that includes sort of industrial varnishes or anything that's used to coat a surface and make it durable or shiny or hard. And sometimes even, your nail varnish is referred to as lacquer, but that's not what we're talking about today. So when we're talking about modern Vietnamese painting, or in fact the Vietnamese practice of lacquer in general, what's being referred to is an organic substance, and it's actually the sap of a specific tree. And there are various trees native to East and Southeast Asia which can produce the lacquer substance. In Vietnam, the particular variety is the Rhus Succedanea tree. So this is an organic substance. And in Vietnamese, the substance is referred to as Sơn Ta, which literally means our paint, or like local paint. Okay. So lacquer was historically used for a number of purposes. So once the sap is extracted from the tree and worked in various ways, it was used to coat different kinds of objects. And there were many reasons for doing this. So one of the reasons is it makes an object hard. So if you have, for example, an object that's made out of bamboo, the lacquer gives it a hard, impermeable coating. So it's much more resistant to kind of damage. But obviously it has a decorative purpose as well. The rich tones of the lacquer could really alter the experience of an architectural space. So this is Hanoi's Temple of Literature, and you can see the entire internal structure has lacquered elements. So there's lacquered panels, there's lacquer coating the statues, there's lacquered furniture, but even the pillars in the structure are lacquered, so that when you go in, there's this sort of sense of glowing light as you encounter the red lacquered architectural features and elements. So obviously this is much more than just a practical purpose. This really has a sort of spiritual, decorative, artistic purpose as well. And lacquer was used for these kind of purposes in Vietnam for centuries. Okay. And here's some examples of various different objects where you can see different uses have been made of the lacquer for these kind of traditional purposes. So here, a statue of one of the Qin queens, a lacquered wood sculpture from the 17th century, where you can see the use of red and gold to coat the figure of the statue. 19th, early 20th century throne, and here, from the ACM collection, lacquered box and a lacquered pipe stand. And in particular, you can see the pipe stand has a lot of mother-of-pearl inlay work in these kind of beautiful floral designs. So actually, within the Vietnamese tradition, there was a lot of mother-of-pearl inlay work as part of the production of lacquered objects and furniture. So these are some later images, but I'm showing them here because around the time that lacquer painting began to develop as a kind of modern form, these practices of furniture decoration, craft, artisanal uses of lacquer were still active. So these are various boutiques and ateliers in Hanoi in the 1920s. You can see in the archival images One is a picture of a lacquered leather workshop. The other one is a workshop where they're sculpting wooden objects that might later have been lacquered. And then this is a boutique selling lacquered objects. And you can see the sign in Vietnamese and in French, Fabrication des objets lacqués, in one of the streets in Hanoi. So, you know, the idea of lacquer as part of the sort of objects that you could buy and use in Hanoi in this period was there. All right, so in this image, you can see what the substance itself looks like. And these are samples of lacquer put together by the Hanoi Vocational School, which is an area, you know, a school where you can train in the lacquer process. And you can see these jars contain the lacquer substance in various different states. So at the very far end here, the Sun Song, this is actually the raw lacquer. So once it's extracted, this is what it looks like, and it settles into layers. So you can see there's a layer at the bottom and a layer at the top. And different layers of it are used for different parts of the process, you know, they're different grades, in effect, of the lacquer. You can also see next to it Sun Ten and Sun Kanzan. Sun Ten is the black lacquer, so that's the raw lacquer that's been processed probably with an iron tool so that it oxidizes to black. The Sun Kanzan, this means cockroach wing lacquer. Don't be alarmed. No cockroaches were harmed in the making of this lacquer. It's just a reference to the color. So it has this translucent brown color, which in fact is also caused by a reaction in the lacquer itself. And we'll see in a moment how that takes place. Okay. So the lacquer substance is typically, or historically, was very reactive. So it couldn't be mixed with a lot of colorful pigments. And that's the reason why, so in these two paintings that we're looking at today, we're looking at one mountainous landscape with trees, one riverscape with water and trees and rocks, but you'll see that they're both painted in red, gold, and brown. And the reason is that in this period, it was very difficult for the artists to find a pigment which could mix cool colors into the lacquer. A lot of pigments would react with the lacquer and turn black or, you know, be unstable in some way. So that's why when we look at lacquers from the colonial period, they're nearly always made with this color palette. Today, it's not the case. There's all sorts of industrial chemical pigments that can mix successfully with the lacquer and produce colored forms of lacquer. But that wasn't the case in this period. It was much harder. And because these artists were experimenting, sometimes things did go wrong with the pigments that they chose. But that's why I think it's really interesting to see, when we look closer at these works, we'll see the artists had a very limited color palette to use, but they made quite extraordinary technical use of what they had. And we'll look more closely at the different varieties of kind of red and gold and the treatments that they could draw from at the time. Okay, so modern lacquer and lacquer painting. How did lacquer become painting? To answer this question, we have to discuss some specific circumstances relating to the French colonial presence in Vietnam. So in fact, modern lacquer painting developed during the French colonial period. And as part of French colonial intervention in Vietnam, the administration established a number of art schools, or schools related to both art and craft. These schools were intended to produce objects for the colonial market, so things like furnishings, art, decorative objects, but they were also part of a colonial civilizing mission. So obviously this idea is very repugnant and offensive to us today, the idea that the natives needed to be civilized, or that, you know, it should be the responsibility of French educators to teach their Vietnamese students how to produce art or crafts. But nonetheless, that was the ideology of the time, and that was the thinking that informed the creation of these art schools. So in fact, the first school to be created which focused on lacquer objects was actually created in the south of Vietnam in 1901. It was the École de Thu Dao Mot, and it was a specialist school which focused on cabinetry and lacquering, and you can see some examples here. So these are actually decorative furnishing schemes designed by the students of this school and exhibited at the 1937 exposition in Paris. And I think if you look at the style of the furnishing, this kind of slightly geometric, very clean looking design, you can see how it's been influenced by the taste for Art Deco. And in fact, Art Deco itself was very inspired by Asian forms, including the material of lacquer. So this school tended to focus on furniture and cabinetry, but it did also produce some lacquer painting. For example, this aquatic work, now in the collection of the Musée du Quai Branly. In 1925, another art school opened in Hanoi, the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, or the Indochina School of Fine Arts. And this school had a somewhat different orientation. So unlike the pre-existing schools, which were kind of intended to focus more on existing craft practices in Vietnam, the Indochina School was modeled much more on the fine art academies of Europe. So it had various disciplines in place that were modeled on the École des Beaux-Arts model in Paris. Things like making the practice of drawing very central in the training. So drawing from nature, drawing from the model, and even drawing from plaster casts of kind of classical statues. These were all parts of the curriculum. Also things like the study of geometric perspective, the study of anatomy, and the study of oil painting on canvas. So in fact, this school introduced, in many respects, a very European idea of fine arts and a fine arts curriculum. At the same time, however, the school also had an ethos of encouraging students to renovate what they perceived as their own tradition. So the school would encourage the students to take field trips and kind of look at architectural examples of Vietnamese architecture. They also encouraged the students to experiment with silk painting, and one of the other mediums that the students started to look at was the medium of lacquer. But they wanted to approach it in a new way. It's at this point that lacquer, instead of being regarded more as something that produces an object or coats an object, it became more like a medium of itself and something that could be used for modern forms of expression. So in some sense, it became a local version of modern painting. But you can see initially, it still had quite a crossover with decorative functions. So these are also works produced by students from the Indochina School. This one you can see probably by the artist Pham Hao is the opening doors of a cabinet. And this is the type of cabinet that it would have been. And then here, in the exhibition Colonial of 1931, you can see a display of some of the earliest lacquers made by the school, and they're mounted into the walls. So this is also very sort of Art Deco aesthetic of having paneled lacquer walls. But as lacquer art developed, it became more and more independent of this decorative function. And so for many artists, it became a means of expression in itself, rather than part of a kind of furniture scheme or part of a room scheme. And the artist who's most associated with this is Nenza Qi, who was one of the most brilliant students of the Indochina School in the 1930s and was associated with a very free, expressive, creative way of working the lacquer and creating modern paintings. So this is one of his works from around 1936. You can see it's on a huge scale, 290 by 440 centimeters. You might have seen the work itself because we've exhibited it here at the National Gallery a few times. And this work, The Fairies, is a kind of very strong statement about the creative potential of lacquer. You can see it has a very strong rhythmic quality. The figures seem to kind of fade and emerge from the background. There's a lot of dynamism in the work. And this is typical of Nenza Qi's kind of approach that lacquer is a form of painting and can be very kind of creatively expressive. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about the issue of technique. And what does it actually take for lacquer to become a painting in that sense? So here we have a diagram also from the Hanoi Vocational School about the preparation of the baseboard, which in Vietnamese is called the vok. So this is the wooden board on which the lacquer is eventually painted. And here you can see examples of the vok in the stage of preparation. So all of these panels here are different operations that have to take place before the vok is ready. So you can see there's a lot of them, a lot of different coats of preparatory treatment and a lot of different coats of lacquer, and this is before the artist even begins to create the actual painting part, the expressive part of the design. So the VOC has to be quite meticulously prepared. So first, the wooden baseboard is wrapped in a layer of cloth that's been soaked in a mixture of lacquer and clay. This is kind of wrapped around the board, you can see here. And then layers of lacquer are applied, and each layer has to be allowed to set in a certain kind of humid atmosphere. So actually, lacquer painting requires a lot of humidity to set and harden. And it can sometimes take several days or even more time for the lacquer coat to harden, and the next layer is applied. So, each layer of this process can take many days. So this gives an indication of the amount of work and preparation that's required before the painting can begin. So what I'd like to do now is share with you, this is a video made by the National Gallery. So this video is with the artist Nguyễn Viet, who is an exceptional lacquer artist in his own right, but also in his earlier years when he was first learning the lacquer, he was the informal student of Nenza Qi, who painted this work we're going to be discussing later. And Nenza Qi was kind of his mentor and helped him learn a lot about the lacquer when they were kind of together in Ho Chi Minh City. So we asked Nguyễn Viet to film a small demonstration, which he did over a few days, but of course the real process itself takes much longer than that. But in this you can see the different ways that he prepares the raw lacquer, some things about how he prepares the board, and then how the process of lacquer painting actually takes place. So let's have a look.
Trong sơn mài mình làm, đây là từ sơn sống thì chế ra cánh dán và sơn đen. Đây là sơn sống đổ vào cái thố này bằng gốm. Nguyên tắc của nó là không được có chất sắt. Cái sơn này mà có sắt vào thì nó sẽ đen.
So this is him preparing the raw lacquer, turning it into the cockroach lacquer.
Sơn đen khi nãy giới thiệu đó là nguyên tắc của nó là sắt và cái chảo sắt và cái cây sắt. Cây sắt này thì nếu mà muốn cho nó ra cái chất sắt ấy.
So it's interesting to note that for both the cockroach wing and the black lacquer, this is a reaction in the lacquer itself rather than a pigment that's being mixed in.
Làm hai mặt giống nhau.
So here's the VOC with the cloth wrapping.
Và chét sơn lên sẽ được hai mặt góc đều có vải hết. Đây là bột chu này. Bột chu thì mình trộn với sơn và mình chét lên cái này. Tiếng thợ sơn mài gọi là hom. Mỗi lần là đều mài nước. Được 3 lần thì nó nhẵn là được cái miếng vóc như thế này. Đây gọi là vóc sơn mài, là hoàn chỉnh rồi. Bây giờ mình có thể vẽ lên, bôi màu lên, dán bạc lên, gắn trứng lên hay làm gì cũng được. Đây là công đoạn là nó xong cái miếng. Trong cái kỹ thuật vẽ sơn mài thì vỏ trứng là khó nhất. Ứng dụng thì phổ thông nhất là dùng trứng vịt.
You might have noticed that the pair of hands has changed. That's because Nguyễn Viet likes for his wife to place the eggshell. He thinks she has more delicate hands at doing the eggshell inlay.
Hay là vàng vào bột. Đây là hết cái bạc. Bây giờ đến dán vàng. Là mình một là để nguyên lá mình dán, hai là mình rây thành bột mịn. Son tức là nó là loại màu đỏ nhưng mà nó là cổ truyền. Tức là ở Hà Nội bây giờ chỉ có 2 gia đình làm được thôi. Cái tranh vỏ trứng này nó là một dạng tranh trừu tượng. Vì thế nó không có đi đến một cái kết thúc nào cả. Nó cứ đi tự nó vận động như thế nào cho đến lúc cảm thấy nó xong là nó xong. Cái rửa nước của cái vóc thì nó bình thường và luôn luôn có cái hồ nước để mình mài để các cái hạt cát, hạt gì nó không cào xước mặt tranh. Nguyên tắc là lúc mình rửa là tất cả cát hay cái gì trên mặt là đánh bóng. Thì thông thường là mình đánh bằng tay không. Khi nó bóng rồi thì cho cái bột chu vào thì nó sẽ bóng được một độ nữa. Ngoài Bắc họ đánh bằng bột than hoặc là dùng tóc dài dài của phụ nữ đánh. Đánh bóng thì nó có tác dụng là để kiểm tra cái độ phẳng. Cái độ phẳng ấy, càng phẳng thì càng sang. Nguyên tắc một cái tranh sơn mài mà nó quý ấy, là nó giống như một cái tảng đá mà mình cắt thẳng ra, mài phẳng. Đấy là cái sơn mài lý tưởng.
So that little text that we saw in the close-up in the corner of the work, that was saying that he's dedicating this lacquer painting to Nguyễn Gia Trí. It's like a little dedication text. So some interesting things to notice from that demonstration. So we saw him preparing the lacquer substance and preparing the board, but also you could see what happens when the artist actually begins to apply the design part of the lacquer. So he was painting, various things with the lacquer and then applying inlay. So things like the gold leaf, the eggshell, and at one point you saw him with a knife kind of chipping away at the surface. So that was to clear an area for the eggshell to be laid down like an incision. Sorry, not an incision, like an indent, so that there's a lowered space for the lacquer, the eggshell, to be placed onto the surface of the work. Obviously, he was using a mixture of colors. So you could see a really bright blue and kind of yellows, colors that weren't available to the artists in the colonial period. The other very interesting thing is the process of sanding. And this is one of the areas where modern lacquer painting really is distinct from oil painting. So if you imagine you create an oil painting, you build up the layers of oil on the surface and you don't take them away. What you see straight away what you paint. But in the case of lacquer, the layers are built up and then can be sanded back. So that means if there are multiple colors of lacquer applied on top of one another, then you can sand down and choose how much of the underlayers you want to reveal. So quite often when you see a lacquer painting, there's a very sort of beautiful mottled or variegated effect in the colors, and that's a deliberate aesthetic choice made by how much the artist has chosen to sand back. That's also why lacquer paintings can take a very long time, because if the artist chooses to add many, many layers, then sand, then add, then sand, this is a very slow and meticulous process. Some lacquer painters also say that it creates an element of surprise, because as you sand back, you don't know exactly how it's going to be revealed with the underlayer. And in fact, this sanding process is so important that the Vietnamese term for modern lacquer painting is sơn mài. And the mai literally refers to the grinding back of the paint, the grinding or the sanding back of the paint. And then finally, once the artist feels that the composition has reached a certain amount of completion, and that could be anything from months to potentially years, then there's a kind of final polishing stage. And Xuân Viet talked about in the video how the lacquer should be kind of smooth, a smooth surface. But not necessarily shiny, which is something I'll talk about in relation to these works as well. Okay, so let's turn now to these artworks, and I want to introduce first a little bit of background about the artist Nguyễn Gia Trí. So Nguyễn Gia Trí was born in 1908 in Hà Đông, and he joined the class of the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, eventually graduating in 1936. He actually studied largely in the oil painting department rather than graduating specifically in lacquer. And I think that informed his approach. That's the reason why perhaps he always took quite a painterly approach to lacquer. Apart from being active as an artist, he was also closely connected to other members of the Vietnamese intelligentsia of the period. And I should say that the 1930s was a very dynamic time in Vietnamese modernity. So apart from rising nationalism and new currents of political thought, there was also an explosion of new forms in literature, in fashion, in architecture, in journalism. So art was part of an overall kind of dynamic moment in Vietnamese modern culture. And Nguyễn Gia Trí was a person who was kind of close to other members of this culture. So he was an illustrator and a cartoonist for the modernizing periodical Nene, and allegedly also active in anti-colonial and perhaps nationalist politics of the period too. So he was a very interesting figure. and became very successful with his lacquer painting. When the First Indochina War broke out, so that the Vietnamese Revolution took place in 1945, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, but as a kind of national front. And following that, there was a 9-year war of independence against the French, the First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954. So during that time, Nenza Qi temporarily fled Vietnam for a while, and when he returned, he settled in the south of Vietnam, in the city that was then known as Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. And in Saigon, he continued to practice lacquer, and he began to be inspired by other types of movements in modern art, including abstraction. So he continued to produce the sort of whimsical images of women in the garden that we know from the colonial period, but he also made some works of kind of abstract lacquers, other types of lacquer. And he continued to practice lacquer up until his death, which was in 1993. Okay, so this is another example of his work from the colonial period. It's held in the Vietnam Fine Arts Museum. And it's in a double-sided screen-type format. So you can see what we're looking at here is two sides of the same painting, made in 1939. And what's wonderful about this painting is Nenza Qi is really showing his dexterity with the medium, because of one side, the women in the garden, is sort of quite neat and controlled. It has a fairly flat kind of gold leaf background, quite meticulous patterning, for example, on the ladies' aozai dresses. The other side is much wilder and freer, you know, this exaggerated leaf motif, which looks a little bit like the sort of scale of motif you might see in a Japanese painting, a Japanese screen painting. But the lacquer itself has a very mottled, variegated texture. So two sides of the painting, two very different approaches to the medium. And I thought I'd share this just because I think it's rather sweet, but he even drew in lacquer. So these are lacquer sketches on paper where he's used a little bit of the lacquer to enhance the lines. So he had a kind of lifetime love affair with the medium. Okay, so I'm going to head over here. I can't ask you to join me right now, but I'm going to point out some things, and I hope that after the talk you can take a minute to have a look. So this work is called Landscape of Vietnam. I don't know if that was really the original title. But the first thing to notice is the composition itself. You can see it's a vertically oriented landscape. So it actually looks a lot like the format of a Chinese hanging scroll landscape. You have the sort of mountain image in the background coming down through various clumps of trees to a sort of framed image in the foreground. So rather than getting a sense of a kind of geometric perspectival regression, there's more the sense of the mountain and the space sort of trickling down to the foreground through the trees. So it's quite similar, I think, to the sort of sense of different distances in the Chinese hanging scroll format of landscape. What many people miss in this painting is there's actually two figures here. So there's two women carrying the sort of carrying pole with baskets attached. Maybe they're on their way home from the market or something like that. And they're painted quite freely, almost like a sort of folkloric stylization, quite stylized figures. They're wearing a rural dress, rural costume, not the modernized aozai dress. One of the other interesting things to notice is, excuse me, the pigment in their skin is slightly grayish. That probably wasn't the artist's original intention for the color. So this is probably a result of some kind of issue over time with whatever the pigment was or the metallic powder was that the artist mixed with the lacquer. So this is one of the examples that I was talking about where sometimes, because the artists in this period were experimenting with the medium, they produced something that wasn't necessarily stable over time. So that's why we have these gray-skinned figures here. Okay, so you can see that Nenza Qi has made the most of the limited color palette that he had by exploring a range of different decorative effects within the lacquer. So up the top, the sky, you can see this gilded area of the sky. I suspect that this might have been made by laying down of gold leaf, because a bit like we saw in Swan Viet's video, because of the flatness. So you can see it's kind of more like a flat expanse. Whereas here, on the leaves of the palm trees, this section, what you can see if you look from the side, is that they're actually in slight relief. They're slightly raised from the surface of the work. So most likely, what the artist has done is when the surface is sanded back and is flat, he's allowed a certain amount of lacquer work to exist above that surface. So repainted the trees above the surface so that it's slightly raised. And that's why they kind of pop. So even where the gold is against the gold of the back, it's because of this slight relief. The artist has also made a very meticulous and detailed effort, you can see, to distinguish the individual leaves through the use of kind of shadowing in the lacquer. Sorry, I'm getting slightly out of breath because of the mask. It's very hard to talk for so long with the mask on. I'll just catch my breath and then keep going. Here, on the other hand, you can see what the artist has done in this beautiful section of the bamboo leaves is combine layers of red and gold. So because he's painting the gilded lacquer right on top of the red lacquer, then it has this beautiful kind of tonal effect. Some of the other things that we can see is that it looks like down here, it's not quite clear, but it looks like something might have been sprinkled onto the lacquer, because you can see little tiny specks of some kind of metallic powder. I can't identify exactly the metal, but one of the techniques that they could use, which was in fact borrowed from Japanese lacquerware, is that when the lacquer's wet, you sprinkle over a metallic powder so that it sticks in the lacquer, and then when the lacquer hardens, there's a kind of metal dusting. So in Japanese lacquer, this is called maki-e, but probably the Vietnamese artists were looking at that technique and kind of borrowed some aspects of it. So if you look closely here, you can see it looks like there's been some kind of sprinkling. And then finally in the middle here, I wanted to draw your attention to this part, because you can see that there's very uneven texture. There's a kind of shiny black lacquer, but also these areas of patches of roughness where you can see other colors coming through. And this is probably the effect of the artist sanding back at the top layer. So that's one of the areas where you can see the effect of the layers beneath being brought up via the sanding process. And interestingly, that technique also exists in Japanese lacquerware. You can sometimes see lacquered objects that have layers of black lacquer beneath a layer of red lacquer, which are then sanded. So you get little sections of black appearing up under the red. I think this technique is called negoro lacquer. But here it's used in the overall composition of the painting. Okay. So that's this work. So it's really showing an amazing number of different possibilities for combining the lacquer and pigments, even though the lacquer pigments and the metallic additions, even though Nguyễn Gia Trí only had access to this fairly limited range of colors. Okay, I'll come back over here because then I want to introduce some more about this artist, Nguyễn Văn Tỵ. Nguyễn Văn Tỵ was born in Hanoi in 1917, and he also attended the Indochina School of Fine Arts from 1939 to 1941. He was active in lacquer painting as well as in several other media. And one of his best-known paintings from this early period is this work, Young Women and the Sea, also in the collection of the Vietnam Fine Arts Museum. So you can see here, this work really heavily features the eggshell inlay technique. And the artist has used it to create a very dynamic, modern-looking work. Because often when we see eggshell inlay, the effect is quite geometric, meticulous. But here, the effect is really wild. It's almost like its streaks of paint have been created using the eggshells. And the modernity, we also get a sense of the modernity of the work, not just because of this sort of dynamic, vibrant style, but also because of the subject matter. The nude woman emerging from the sea. I think in some senses it could be a reference to Western art, but also just the very idea of representing the nude figure is a kind of modern idea in the context of Vietnamese art. So you can see in this work how lacquer was also becoming connected to new ideas about painting, new subjects in painting. So To start off with, Nenza Qi and Nguyễn Văn Tỵ both had quite a similar background. They're both from the north, they both trained at the Indochina School of Fine Arts. But in the end, their careers took a very different turn. So I described earlier how Nenza Qi had moved to the south of Vietnam and he continued to practice his lacquer there. Nguyễn Văn Tỵ, on the other hand, stayed in the north. So he was active in the Viet Minh during the war against the French in 1946 to 1954. And after that, he settled back in Hanoi. So after the wartime period in Hanoi, this was the time of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So this is the communist-led state in the north. And at that time, the required style for artists to practice was socialist realism. So artists had to create works that looked very realistic and that represented the lives of workers, farmers, and soldiers. So when Nguyễn Văn Tỵ continued to work, that was the kind of subject matter he had to paint. He couldn't paint abstraction in the same way as, for example, Nenza Qi could in the south. So their careers also illustrate these divergent paths. So let's look at this work in some more detail. And in fact, this artwork also has a very fascinating history. So far in my introduction to lacquer, I was talking more about the French colonial period in Vietnam, but to fully understand this artwork, we also need to discuss the period of the Japanese occupation. So during World War II, as I'm sure many of you know, Japan invaded and occupied many different areas of Southeast Asia, including areas of the former Indochina. And this was a period of great turbulence, violence, trauma for many parts of Asia, and extreme hardship. So the Japanese occupying forces would exploit the areas under occupation for labor and for resources. This was also true in Indochina. But in Indochina, the situation was slightly different because by the time the Japanese military occupation arrived, Indochina was actually under Vichy French control. So in fact, the Vichy French government, who was controlling Indochina at that time, was an ally of Japan. This was kind of different to other circumstances elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So in fact, the two governments, the French colonial administration and the Japanese military occupation, sort of had to coexist in an uneasy alliance. This doesn't mean that the experience was necessarily any easier for the occupied population. And in fact, by the end of the Japanese occupation, there'd been a horrific famine throughout Vietnam. So as part of the sort of ideological rhetoric of the Japanese occupation period was this idea of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And this idea was promoted by the Japanese to justify their presence in other parts of Asia. And it was an idea that Asian values under the kind of leadership of Japan could unify and strengthen this area. So it's a bit like also the justifying ideas of other aspects of sort of Western colonialism, a kind of justifying rhetoric that has some sort of greater ideal, but also allows for a kind of very exploitative or often violent or unpleasant colonial relationship that's actually taking place. But because of this ideal, one of the things that was pursued in Indochina at this time was cultural exchanges with Japan. So in fact, 2 touring exhibitions of Japanese art came to Vietnam during the Japanese occupation period, an exhibition of Nihonga, or Japanese-type painting, and an exhibition of Yoga, or Western-type Japanese oil painting. And both of these exhibitions toured Vietnam. And then a reciprocal exhibition also traveled to Japan, so works that were produced from throughout Indochina, including a number of works from graduates of the Indochina School of Fine Arts, toured several cities in Japan in 1943. And as part of this tour, 3 Vietnamese artists, Nguyễn Văn Tỵ, Nam Son, and Lung Xuan Ni, were also invited to make a visit to Japan. So they went to Japan, toured the sites, and also met Japanese artists. And I think this would have been very interesting for them because they could encounter Japanese artists and see the way that Japanese painters used materials like silk, which was also used in Vietnam, and used materials like lacquer. So the scholar who's researched these Japanese occupation period exchanges very extensively is Professor Masahiro Ushiro Shoji, and he has identified that in fact this painting, The Rapids of Cho Bo, is one of the works that traveled to Japan as part of this touring exhibition of 1943. So it kind of does have an extraordinary history. In fact, he recently said in a talk to the National Gallery audience that this is the only work he's been able to, the only extant work that he's been able to identify. So this work has an extraordinary history based on the very kind of complex political circumstances of that time. Because we knew that when Nguyễn Văn Tỵ had traveled to Japan, we wondered if he'd learnt any lacquer techniques there that were relevant to this work. But in fact, I think this work must have been produced beforehand because it was part of the traveling exhibition. But in a sense, I think that shows that Vietnamese artists were most likely already looking at and integrating certain aspects of Japanese technique by this point anyway. So the development of the modern painting in lacquer process was informed by research from different lacquer traditions that they looked at. Okay, so let's have a look at the image itself. It's a scene of the rapids at Cho Bo, which is actually a part of the Black River in North Vietnam. And it's a very popular area for artists to go and paint. So in fact, one of the things that the artists of the Indochina school used to practice was kind of painting field trips, where they'd go out to scenic spots in the countryside and, you know, paint the scenery. Obviously, a lacquer painting like this couldn't be painted in plein air in place. So what the artist would have done was take photographs or draw sketches and then come back to the lacquer studio and build up the composition over time. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the features. So again, I think this sky area is probably made by gold leaf, in this case applied on a grounding of red lacquer, so you can see where the red is coming through. And then interestingly here, you can notice that all of this beautiful line work that the artist has used to indicate the kind of swirling water of the rapids looks as if it might have been incised into the wood. So if you look closely, you can see it's a little depression. So I think the lines are actually incised and then the gold is put into the depressions. Here, you can see, if you look closely in the rock area, it has quite a gritty texture to it. And there's little, looks like little shell fragments or grit fragments kind of embedded in the lacquer. I think it must have been sprinkled on, but in a very sort of free-form way. I should say, you know, because we don't have an account of how specifically these paintings were made, I'm making what I hope are informed guesses based on the visual evidence. Another really interesting thing to notice is that the artist really plays with surface texture. So you can see this section of the mountains here has a really high sheen. It's very highly polished, shiny black. Whereas other parts are fairly kind of dull or even rough, and the red, for example, isn't particularly shiny. And that's because Vietnamese modern lacquers didn't necessarily value a very shiny surface. And I think this is one of the areas where it's a little bit different to lacquer in the decorative tradition. If you think of a beautiful lacquered box, you might think of something that has a very high sheen, you know, a very high, hard sheen, quite reflective. Whereas for both of these paintings, you can see it's not necessarily a reflective texture. It can be quite a rough texture when you look at it. And that's because so many different textured effects were part of the production of the work, that what was valued was, as Xuân Viet said, a sort of smoothness and flatness, but not a high sheen. The other interesting thing is you can see this work is painted in 3 panels, and they have little feet, almost like a screen panel, but then it's hung on the wall like a painting. And I suppose this shows that artists in this period were producing things that were both objects and paintings. So they sometimes would produce things that could stand on the floor as screens, and they sometimes would produce doors of cabinets, as well as things that were flat on the wall like a painting. The way that it's framed, and this is quite common with Vietnamese lacquers, is that then it's encased in a frame that has a kind of U-channel at the base, like a bracket, and then the 3 screen pieces sit in the bracketed frame. Okay. You can see also, I think some of the dullness in these areas is also to do with how the pigments, or how the, probably the metallic powders have aged over time, and that's why there's a sort of a slight graying of the color. All right, so before I leave you, or before we go into questions, I thought I'd just show a few examples of Vietnamese lacquer painting today. So many artists are still active in painting Vietnamese lacquer, and these are just two artists I wanted to give as examples. This is the artist Lê Thoa Tien, an artist who's born in the city of Hue in central Vietnam. And his work is very inspired by the culture of that city, you know, the imperial ancient culture of Hue, also by his practice as a Buddhist. So his works in lacquer are very meditative. These are 3 works from the Reflection series, which the artist has made, I believe, since the late 90s until fairly recently. And you can see that in the center, they have this very deep, glossy black lacquer, but then they're bordered by other kind of decorative effects. So it's a little bit like the format of a mirror, but instead of seeing the mirrored surface, you have the surface, the deep black surface of the lacquer. And I think the idea is that the viewer kind of really immerses themselves in the viewing experience of the lacquer, which is intended to be meditative. And of course, I'm sure you might have seen this work before. This is a work by the artist Phi Van Nguyen. And the work is called Specula. Phi Van Nguyen is an artist who's given a lot of thought to the conceptual basis of making lacquer, and tried to think about the idea of lacquer as painting in a new way. So instead of painting the lacquer on a flat wooden surface, she's made a number of technical experiments to allow her to bind the natural lacquer with other types of substrate. So in this case, this is lacquer on epoxy and fiberglass composite, and what it's meant is that she could create a huge lacquered structure, a kind of tunnel-like structure. And if you recall, back to the very beginning, the slide I showed of the Temple of Literature, it's almost like this is harking back to the idea of a lacquered interior, or lacquer as architectural space. In a subsequent experiment, palimpsest from 2012 to 2014, the artist actually managed to create very thin films of lacquer, almost like lacquer skins, that were bound to glass. And because they were on glass, they could be projected. So what we're looking at here is actually projections of little pieces of lacquer on glass, and the light through the projector is allowing us to see the different layers of the lacquer in the form of a light image. So again, a very experimental approach to how lacquer can be used. And I guess also playing on lacquer's translucency, the idea that you can see through multiple layers. A lot of the time, because the baseboard is dark and the underlying coats are black, that translucency is lost. But this is a work that brings that to the fore. Oh, sorry. And finally, the work that we showed here a few years ago at National Gallery. This was a 2-part show, Radiant Material. And the large work you'll recognize from earlier in this talk is Nenza Qi's Le Fay from the 1930s. And in response, Phi Van made a commissioned work, Pro Se. And this work played with the idea of the screen as we experience it today. You know, not something that's made of wood and divides our rooms, but something that we look at all the time on our phones, on our iPads. So the idea of the perpetual image taking and image making that we do using our personal devices. So the artist played with this, and she made a number of these lacquer objects that kind of resembled the iPad format, and yet had this very deep, textured approach to lacquer. So almost like forcing us to slow down the gaze and forcing us to kind of contemplate the amazing kind of reach of the images that we have in our personal kind of day-to-day image collections. So here, this is a detail of the same work. In this case, these were pieces of lacquer on metal. So in the exhibition, you could actually pick them up and handle them, and you feel that they had a sort of heavy weight that was very like the weight of a digital device. Okay, so that's the end of my part of the talk today, but I'd be delighted to hear any questions from you, and please let me know if there's anything that you'd like to ask. I also hope that, while practicing safe distancing, you can come up and take a close look at the works and explore some of the details that I mentioned just now.